I stood in my kitchen on Thanksgiving morning, staring at a table set for 17 people who never came. The turkey had been out of the oven for 2 hours. The mashed potatoes were cold. The rolls I had baked from scratch were sitting in a basket under a dish towel, like I was still expecting someone to walk through that door any minute. Nobody called, not one of them. That was the night something inside me stopped hurting and started deciding. My name is Bernard Owens. I'm 67 years old. I spent 38 years building a life in Connecticut with my wife Margaret, raised 3 kids, ran a small construction company for 30 years, and buried the woman I loved after watching cancer take her piece by piece over 24 months. What happened after that is what I'm here to tell you about. Before I get into it, where are you watching from? Drop your city or state in the comments. I always wonder who is out there listening. Margaret and I met in 1984. She was a 3rd-grade teacher. I was running a 2-man crew doing residential framing out of a beat-up pickup truck. We were not rich, we were not fancy, but we were good together, and we built something solid over the years. A house in a quiet Connecticut neighborhood. 3 kids we were proud of. A construction company that grew from 2 guys to 14. A life that felt like it was going exactly where it was supposed to go. Our oldest, Philip, grew up sharp and driven, got into software engineering, moved to Boston, made good money. Our middle son, Nolan, was quieter, became a high school history teacher, stayed closer to home. Our daughter, Irene, the youngest, was always the emotional one. Big feelings about everything. Always needed the most reassurance out of all of them. We paid for all 3 of their college educations without any of them taking on debt. We helped with down payments on their first homes. Margaret and I babysat grandkids on weekends without being asked, because we wanted to. We showed up to every graduation, every birthday party, every school play. That was just how Margaret and I were raised, and it was how we raised our kids. Family shows up. That was the rule in our house. Then Margaret got sick. It was stage 3 breast cancer, diagnosed in the spring of 2012. I will not walk through all of it because some things are hard to put into words even years later. What I will tell you is that the 2 years that followed were the hardest of my life, harder than anything I had dealt with in 67 years. I scaled back the business. I handed day-to-day operations to my foreman and told him to call me only if the building was on fire. I drove Margaret to chemotherapy twice a week for months. I learned her medication schedule the way I used to memorize job site blueprints. I learned which foods she could stomach during treatment and which ones made things worse. I learned how to help her shower on the days she was too weak to stand on her own without making her feel like she had lost her dignity. I slept lightly for 2 years because I was always listening for her in the night. The kids came when they could. Philip flew in from Boston a handful of times. Nolan stopped by on weekends when his schedule allowed. Irene called regularly and visited maybe once a month. I understood they had their own lives and I was not keeping score. But it was Margaret and me mostly getting through it together, the way we had gotten through everything else. She passed on a Tuesday morning in March 2014. She was 64 years old. I was holding her hand. The funeral was full. Margaret had taught 3rd grade for 30 years and she had touched a lot of lives in this town. Over 300 people came. My 3 kids were there with their families, all 6 grandkids. Philip's wife Sandra, who worked as a senior loan officer at a regional bank and always carried herself like she was the most organized person in any room, helped coordinate the reception. I was grateful for that because I was not capable of coordinating anything that week. I was barely getting through each hour. The night after the funeral, after everyone had gone home and it was just family left in the living room, Philip looked at me and said, "Dad, we are going to get through this together. We will take care of each other." Nolan nodded. Irene had her head on my shoulder and was crying. I believed every word Philip said. I had no reason not to. The first few weeks they were attentive. Philip called every couple of days. Nolan came over on weekends and mowed the lawn without being asked, the way I used to do things for my own father without being asked. Irene checked in every morning, sometimes twice. Sandra organized a meal train with neighbors so I would not have to cook. It felt like we were a family pulling together through something hard, which is exactly what I thought we were then. Slowly things shifted. The calls from Philip dropped from every few days to once a week, then every couple of weeks. Nolan's weekend visits became every other week, then monthly, then occasional. Irene still called, but the conversations got shorter. I told myself they were busy. They had kids in school, mortgages, demanding jobs. I did not want to be the father who guilted his children into attention. I gave them space, and I kept myself occupied with the business and the house and trying to figure out what a life looked like when the person you had built it with was gone. That first Thanksgiving without Margaret, I assumed I would spend it with one of the kids. We had always rotated holidays between households, but we had always been together. Always. I called Philip 2 weeks out. He said he and Sandra were keeping it small that year. Just her parents and her sister's family. He said I would understand that it had been a hard year for everyone. I said of course. I called Nolan. He was going upstate with his wife's family. Sorry, Dad, maybe Christmas. I called Irene. She said she would try to stop by Christmas Eve and bring the grandkids. She never showed. I made myself a plate that Thanksgiving and sat at a table that used to seat 12. I told myself it was just 1 year. Everything would settle back to normal once the grief wasn't so fresh for all of us. It did not settle. Year 2, I offered to host Christmas the way Margaret and I always had. I offered to cook the prime rib, put up the tree, make the house look the way it used to. Philip said they were doing Christmas morning with Sandra's parents and it was already planned. Nolan was taking his family to his wife's sister's place in Vermont. Irene said she would try, but Christmas Eve came and went with nothing but a text that said, "Thinking of you, Dad. Merry Christmas." I sat in the living room that Christmas morning with wrapped presents for all 6 grandkids stacked under the tree. Nobody came to pick them up. I donated them to a church toy drive the day after Christmas. Year 3, I stopped waiting to be included and started reaching out earlier. I called in October to plan Thanksgiving. I offered to travel to them instead of making them come to me. I said we could do a restaurant if hosting was too much. There was always a reason it did not work. Plans had changed, maybe next month, maybe after the holidays. That same year, I started seeing my family in photos on Facebook. Birthday parties for my grandchildren I had not been told about. Holiday gatherings with my 3 kids, their spouses, all 6 grandkids, even Margaret's sister and her family. Everyone together and smiling. And me nowhere in any of it. Year 4, I slipped on black ice in the driveway in February and fractured my wrist. I called Philip from the emergency room. He said that sounded painful and that he would try to come by and check on me. He did not come. I managed on my own for 6 weeks. Grocery shopping with one hand, struggling to button my shirts in the morning, sleeping sitting up in the recliner because lying flat was too uncomfortable. Not one of my 3 children came to help their 63-year-old father with a broken wrist. Year 5, I found out my grandson Danny had been accepted into a regional academic honors program. I found out through a neighbor who had seen the announcement in the local paper. I sent Danny a card and a check for $500 and wrote him a note telling him how proud I was. He sent me a text. "Thanks, Grandpa." I never heard another word about it. I did not even know he had started the program until I saw a photo online months later. Year 6, I had a prostate scare. Elevated PSA numbers, a follow-up biopsy, 2 weeks of waiting to find out if I had cancer. I drove myself to every appointment. I sat in every waiting room alone. I did not tell my kids it was happening because by that point I already knew they were not the people I was going to lean on. The results came back benign. I drove home alone, made a sandwich, and sat on the back porch until it got dark. Year 7, I drove 2 hours to surprise Nolan on his birthday. I had called ahead to confirm he would be home. When I pulled up, the street in front of his house was full of cars. Through the front window, I could see balloons, people moving around inside, kids running through the hallway. I knocked on the door holding a homemade chocolate cake I had spent the morning baking. Nolan opened the door and his face went tight. "Dad, what are you doing here?" "It's your birthday. I brought your cake." He glanced back into the house. "This is really just a thing with Karen's family. It's not a great time." He did not invite me in. I left the cake on the porch step and drove home. I had to pull over twice on the way because I could not see the road clearly. What none of my kids knew during any of those years was that I was still helping them financially, quietly, without them asking and without them knowing it was me. When Philip and Sandra hit a rough stretch and fell behind on their mortgage, I covered 4 months of payments through a third-party arrangement that looked like a bank assistance program. When Nolan's youngest daughter needed a surgical procedure that their insurance did not fully cover, I handled the gap anonymously through the hospital billing office. When Irene's husband Dale was trying to get his small landscaping business off the ground and needed capital, I became one of his silent investors through a holding company Clifford Nash set up for me. They took every bit of it and never once asked where it came from. Year 8 is when I first understood what Sandra was actually doing. I got a call from my bank branch manager on a Tuesday afternoon. He said it was a courtesy call, that someone identifying themselves as a family member had contacted the branch asking about my accounts, specifically about whether I had any estate planning documents on file and whether my accounts had designated beneficiaries. The person had not given their name. The manager thought I should know. I hung up the phone and sat at the kitchen table for a long time. I knew it was Sandra. Philip would not have done that on his own. Philip was not that calculating. But Sandra had always been the one who thought 3 moves ahead, always the one who asked careful questions at family dinners about property values in our neighborhood, about what I planned to do with the business eventually, about whether Margaret and I had updated our wills after the kids were grown. I had always brushed those questions off as idle conversation. I was not brushing this off. I did not call Philip. I did not confront anyone. I picked up the phone and called Clifford Nash, who had been my attorney for 25 years and had handled every legal matter for my business since the beginning. I told him what the bank manager had told me. Clifford listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "Document everything, Bernard. Write down the date, the time, what the manager told you, word for word, and call me immediately if anything like this happens again." I wrote it all down that same evening. Then I put the notepad in the fireproof safe in my office and went to bed. It did not happen again, but I did not forget. A few weeks later, I was at Philip's house for a rare Sunday dinner. One of maybe 3 times that year I had actually been invited over. I was in the kitchen getting a glass of water when I heard Sandra and Philip talking in the hallway. They did not know I could hear them. Sandra was saying something about getting a clearer picture of what Dad actually has before things get complicated. She said the word estate twice. She said, "We should know what we are dealing with." Philip said something I could not fully make out. Sandra said, "Just let me handle it." I stood at that kitchen sink and kept my face completely still. I finished my water. I walked back into the living room and sat down and ate dinner with my family and talked about nothing important, the same way I had been doing for years. But something had clarified for me in that hallway. This was not just neglect. Sandra had a plan, and Philip was going along with it. Year 9 is the one I still think about most. Danny, my oldest grandchild, was graduating from high school in June. I had not been invited to his birthday parties in years. I had not been included in family gatherings in longer than I could count. But a high school graduation felt different to me. I called Irene and asked if I could come. She said she would put my name on the list, that it should be fine. I drove 3 hours the morning of the ceremony. I wore the blazer I had worn to Nolan's college graduation years ago. I stopped at a bakery on the way and bought a small box of pastries to bring, because that was the kind of thing Margaret always did when we showed up somewhere. When I got to the school, Sandra was standing near the main entrance. She had a program in her hand, and she was directing people toward the auditorium. She saw me coming from the parking lot, and she did not smile. She walked toward me and met me halfway across the sidewalk. "Dad," she said it the way you say a word when you're buying time. "Today is really just close family. There weren't enough seats in the reserved section. I'm sorry nobody told you." I looked at her. Irene told me to come. Sandra's expression did not change. There must have been a miscommunication. "I'm sorry you drove all this way. You understand, right?" I looked past her toward the entrance. People were filing in. I could see Nolan through the glass doors, laughing with someone. I could see balloons through the window of the lobby. I had driven 3 hours with a box of pastries to watch my grandson graduate, and I was being turned away at the door by my son's wife. I said, "Sure, Sandra, I understand." I walked back to my truck. I put the pastries on the passenger seat. I drove to the far end of the parking lot, and I sat there. After about 10 minutes, I picked up my phone and opened the voice memo app. I started talking. I went through everything I could remember every year, every phone call that did not come, every event I was not told about, every dollar I had quietly sent in one direction or another. I listed the bank call and the date I had written it down. I listed what I had heard Sandra say in that hallway. I talked for almost 40 minutes. When I finished, I saved the file, put my phone in my pocket, and drove home. I did not cry on the way back. I was done crying. I was thinking year 10 was Thanksgiving. I know I should have been past hoping by then. 10 years is a long time to keep setting a table for people who do not show up. But something in me could not fully let go of the idea that my own children would eventually come back around. So I did something I had told myself I would never do. I called each of them and I asked directly. Not hinted, not suggested, asked. I told Philip I needed one holiday, just one. I told him I had been alone for 10 Thanksgivings, and I was not asking for an apology or a long conversation about the past. I just wanted my family at my table one more time. He said he would try to make it work. I called Nolan. He said probably yes. I called Irene. She said it sounded really nice, and she would let me know for sure by the end of the week. She never followed up, but I took the silence as a yes. I spent 3 days cooking: turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, sweet potato casserole, green bean casserole, cranberry sauce, dinner rolls from scratch, and 3 pies. All the things Margaret used to make. I went to the linen closet and found the good tablecloth we had only used for holidays. I bought fresh flowers at the grocery store. I set the table for 17, which counted my 3 kids, their spouses, all 6 grandkids, and a couple of the older grandkids' friends I thought might come along. I wanted it to look the way it used to look when Margaret was alive. I wanted them to walk in and remember what this house felt like when we were all still a family. The turkey came out of the oven at 2 in the afternoon, golden and smelling exactly right. I set it on the counter and started on the last of the side dishes. 2:30 came. Then 3. I called Philip, straight to voicemail. I called Nolan, no answer. I called Irene, nothing. I reheated the side dishes at 4. I told myself traffic was bad. I told myself they were on their way. At 5, I stopped telling myself things and just sat down at the head of the table and looked at the 16 empty chairs around me. The flowers I had bought that morning were already starting to open up in the warmth of the kitchen. The candles I had lit were burning down. Everything I had cooked for 3 days was sitting in serving dishes going cold. At 8 that night, I was still sitting there. I do not know exactly why I did not just get up and put the food away. I think some part of me needed to sit with it to actually see it clearly without looking away. This was what 10 years looked like. This was the answer to every phone call I had made, and every meal I had cooked, and every time I had told myself that next time would be different. I sat at that table until midnight. Then I got up, covered everything in foil, and went to my office. I got out a legal pad and wrote 2 words at the top of the page. No more. The following Monday morning, I was in Clifford Nash's office at 9 a.m. I had not called ahead. His assistant showed me in any way, because I had been coming to that office for 25 years. I sat down across from Clifford and I told him everything. Not just the Thanksgiving, all of it. The 10 years, Sandra and the bank call, what I had overheard in the hallway, the graduation, the voice memo on my phone, the financial support I had been giving quietly for years. I talked for almost an hour. When I finished, Clifford leaned back in his chair and looked at me. He said, "What do you want to do, Bernard?" I said, "I want to sell the company. I want to sell the house. I want to move everything into accounts they cannot touch, and I want to leave, and I want it done right, so that when they come looking, and they will come looking, there is nothing for them to grab onto." Clifford nodded slowly. "That is all entirely within your rights," he said. "Let's get to work." Over the next 3 months, Clifford and I took apart everything I had built in Connecticut piece by piece. The construction company went first. I had a buyer who had been interested for years, a regional developer who had made informal inquiries more than once. We opened formal negotiations in December and closed in February. The final number was $1.4 million. Philip had once told me at a family dinner that the company was a small operation and probably not worth much. I thought about that when I signed the papers. Next was the commercial property I had held for 15 years, a small strip of retail units outside of town that had been generating steady rental income. That sold for $620,000. Then the investment accounts Margaret and I had built up over 4 decades, transferred and restructured with Clifford managing every step. The house went on the market in late February. It sold in 18 days for $890 allows to a young couple who were expecting their first child. I hoped they would fill it with more noise and more love than it had seen in the last decade. Before I left, Clifford and I put together a complete financial record of every dollar I had quietly directed toward my children over the years. Every mortgage payment I had covered for Philip. Every medical bill I had handled for Nolan's daughter. Every dollar I had invested in Dale's business. Each entry was dated, sourced, and notarized. If anyone ever wanted to claim I had been taken advantage of or was not of sound mind, that document was going to end that conversation before it started. I also set up trust funds for all 6 grandkids. Education money structured to be accessed at age 25 with no parental control over the funds. Each trust came with a sealed letter from me, not angry, not accusatory, just honest. My side of the story written clearly so that when those kids were old enough to ask questions, they would have my words to read and make up their own minds. I packed the house myself, 38 years of a life sorted into boxes over 2 weekends. I donated most of it, furniture, dishes, the good china Margaret had picked out the year we got married, the kids' old things I had kept in the attic. I kept what fit in my truck. Some clothes, a box of photo albums, Margaret's wedding ring, the quilt her mother had made. The hardest part was the garage. I had built a proper woodworking shop out there over the years. Good tools, a solid workbench, sawdust in every corner. Margaret used to bring me coffee out there on Saturday mornings and sit on a stool and talk while I worked. I stood in that garage for a long time running my hands over the workbench. Then I loaded the tools into the truck too. They were coming with me. I changed my phone number on a Thursday. I did not leave a forwarding address with anyone except Clifford. I drove out of that driveway on a Friday morning in March, almost exactly 11 years after Margaret had passed, and I did not look back once. I drove straight through to Sarasota, Florida, 22 hours with 1 overnight stop in South Carolina. I had picked Sarasota because Margaret and I had talked about retiring there someday. Warm winters, water nearby, far enough from Connecticut that nobody was going to run into me at the grocery store. I had found a single-story house in a quiet neighborhood with a 2-car garage that was bigger than I needed, which meant it was exactly the right size for what I had in mind. I unloaded the truck over 2 days, set up the bedroom, the kitchen, the basics. On the third day, I set up the woodworking shop in the garage, got the workbench positioned the way I liked it, hung the tools on the pegboard, swept the floor clean. Then I made a pot of coffee and sat in a lawn chair in the open garage door and watched the neighborhood go about its morning. I did not check my phone waiting for someone to call. That was the thing I noticed first in those early weeks. I had spent so many years with that low-level tension running through every day, that constant background awareness of waiting for a call that did not come. Waiting to find out if this would be the week someone remembered to check in. Waiting for Thanksgiving, for Christmas, for some occasion that might bring my family back to the same table. In Sarasota, that waiting was just gone. I woke up and the day was mine from the first minute of it. I joined a fishing club 2 weeks after I arrived, mostly men my age, some older, a couple younger. We went out early on Saturday mornings and did not talk much, and that was exactly what I needed. I started building furniture again in the evenings, nothing complicated. Just the kind of work that keeps your hands busy and your head quiet. A side table, a set of bookshelves, a small bench for the front porch. 3 months after I left Connecticut, Clifford called. "Philip has been to my office," he said. "Sandra has called me 4 times. They hired someone to look for you. Irene has been sending messages to your old email address. What do they want? They found out about the business sale, the property. They are trying to understand where the assets went." I told Clifford to pass along my new email address. I wanted to see what they actually had to say when they had a direct line to me. The emails came within hours. Philip said I was being irrational and that I had scared everyone by disappearing. Nolan said he was worried about me and asked me to please just call him so he knew I was safe. Irene said she could not believe I would walk away from my grandchildren the way I had, that it was not fair to them, that they missed me. Sandra did not email. Instead, a letter arrived at Clifford's office from an attorney suggesting that my recent financial decisions warranted a review, that there were concerns about undue influence and possible cognitive decline. The letter used careful language, but the meaning was clear. She was trying to build a case that I was not in my right mind. Clifford sent back the full documentation. The notarized financial records going back years, the clean sale contracts, the timeline of every decision I had made and when I had made it. The letter from my doctor confirming I was in good health with no cognitive issues. A man who had been quietly managing his own finances for over a decade, selling assets at fair market value with proper legal representation, does not look like a man who is being taken advantage of. The attorney on the other side went quiet within 2 weeks. I wrote one email and sent it to all 3 of my kids at the same time. I told them I was safe and healthy and that I was living better than I had in years. I told them I had spent 10 years trying to stay in their lives and had been turned away from a graduation, left alone on Thanksgiving with food for 17 people, and shut out of my grandchildren growing up, and that none of them had reached out until they realized there was money they could not locate. I told them the trust funds for the grandkids were set and did not involve them. I told them the rest of my money was mine, earned over 30 years of work, and I would spend it or give it away however I chose. And I told them that if any of them genuinely wanted their father back in their lives, not because of obligation and not because of inheritance, I was open to that. But it would be on my terms and they would have to show up consistently, not just when it was convenient. Then I closed the laptop and went out to the garage and started sanding a tabletop. The responses were what I expected. Philip was angry. Nolan said I was being unfair. Irene said I was punishing the grandchildren for something that was not their fault. Nobody said I was right. Nobody said they were sorry. Things went quiet after about 6 months. Clifford told me they had stopped pursuing anything legally. I figured they had moved on, maybe told themselves I was a bitter old man who had lost perspective. I was fine with that. Let them have whatever story helped them sleep at night. It has been 18 months now since I left Connecticut. I wake up early, make coffee, sit in the garage or out on the front porch depending on the weather. Harold, a retired contractor who lives 2 streets over, comes by on Saturday mornings and we drive down to the boat launch before the sun is fully up. I have donated a meaningful portion of what Margaret and I saved to a literacy foundation and a children's medical fund, both causes she believed in. It felt right to use that money the way she would have used it. Last month I got an email from Irene. She said she had been in therapy for almost a year. She said her therapist had helped her understand things she had not wanted to look at before. She said she was wrong, that they were all wrong, and that she was sorry. She asked if I would be willing to talk, slowly, no pressure, just to start. I have read that email more times than I can count. Part of me is cautious. Part of me recognizes the little girl who always felt everything harder than the rest of them and wonders if maybe this time she means it. I have not responded yet. Maybe I will. Maybe I will not. That is entirely up to me. I'm not waiting anymore. I'm not cooking for people who are not coming. I'm not leaving the porch light on hoping someone turns into the driveway. I'm Bernard Owens. I'm 67 years old. I worked hard my whole life. loved my wife with everything I had, raised kids who forgot I existed until they thought there was money in it, and then I did the one thing none of them expected. I walked away first on my own terms with my dignity intact and my finances in order. If there is one thing I want you to take from this, it is that silence is not the same as acceptance. Patience is not the same as weakness. And at some point, a man has the right to stop waiting for people to treat him the way he deserves and just go build a life that does not depend on them. I spent 10 years being forgotten. I'm spending the rest of my time being found. If this story meant something to you, hit subscribe and leave a comment below. There are a lot of us out here who needed to hear this, and every one of your stories matters too.